Welcome to Panel 2 of the Bay of Fundy, Natural Wonder or Nuclear Industry Test Site, recorded on April 29, 2021, with panel speakers Dr. M.V. Ramana, Dr. Edwin Lyman, and Chief Ron Tremblay, moderator Dr. Janice Harvey, and guests Greg Gubko, Gail Wiley, and Nancy Covington.
Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful evening in New Brunswick. I'm not sure where everybody else is, but I know it would be a tempting thing to be out for a walk tonight in Fredericton, at least. So I appreciate your participation. This is the second of two webinars called the Bay of Fundy, Natural Wonder or Nuclear Industry Test Site. The title of the webinar refers to the proposal being actively pursued by the federal and provincial governments to build two prototype nuclear reactors on the site of the existing CANDU 6 reactor, Point Lepreau, which has been operating commercially since 1983 on the New Brunswick shore of the Bay of Fundy, west of St. John. Our expert panel this evening features three speakers: Dr. M.V. Ramana at the University of British Columbia, Dr. Edwin Lyman with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Grand Chief Ron Tremblay with the Wolastoq Grand Council. My name is Janice Harvey. I'm your moderator, facilitator tonight, and I'm an assistant professor in the Environment and Society program at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, a research associate with the UNB Research Project RAVEN, which stands for Rural Action and Voices for the Environment, and I'm a member of the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. I am speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Wolastoqiyik Nation, who, along with the Mi'kmaq and the Pescataway nations, signed several peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown in the 1700s. These treaties did not cede or surrender any territory to the British colonizers, and they impose obligations on current settlers and settler governments that Wolastoq Grand Chief Ron Tremblay will speak about later this evening. To locate myself in this issue, I'm a fifth-generation Gramineaner. Graminan is a small island in the mouth of the Bay of Fundy. And I first learned about nuclear power in university back in the 1970s, when the government announced that a nuclear power plant was going to be built in the midst of four small fishing villages on the Fundy coast: Maces Bay, Dipper Harbor, Chance Harbor, and Lepreau. Having grown up in a fishing family and a fishing village, it seemed like a preposterous, dangerous, and fundamentally unjust proposition. To me, there is something profane about imposing a radioactive and technological juggernaut on a marine wonder like the Bay of Fundy and the people who make their living from those waters. So I joined the anti-nuclear movement, and it shaped the rest of my life journey. We didn't stop the Point Lepreau reactor, but we were part of the movement that turned the tide against nuclear power in the 1980s, resulting in hundreds of canceled nuclear power plants throughout North America, including the proposed Lepreau 2. Now here we are facing down this industry once again. Because our governments are not providing full information about these projects to citizens, it is once again up to concerned citizens to inform ourselves and provide critical information and analysis of these projects to the general public. The RAVEN Project is the host of the two webinar panels this week, and we have 7 co-hosts: the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick, the Canadian Chapter of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, MB Media Co-op, Prevent Cancer Now, Sierra Club of Canada Foundation Atlantic Chapter, and Sierra Club Maine Chapter. Now I'm going to introduce you to representatives of 3 of the co-hosts, beginning with Greg Gubko, the Sierra Club of Canada Atlantic Chapter. Greg?
Hey, thanks for that. So I'm calling in from Chubuktuk on unceded Mi'kmaq territory, also known as Halifax, Nova Scotia. So I'm part of the Atlantic chapter, and I guess we're part of a I guess our philosophy is one that thinks globally and acts locally, and that's kind of our philosophy as a charity, as a foundation. Late last year, in December of last year, we launched a Beyond Coal campaign, but we quickly discovered that coal is one of the many heads of what we call the climate monster, right? And to defeat this climate monster, my colleagues and I are offering kind of an amplifying voice to the many existing land and water defenders that are already doing amazing work. And we're not only offering this amplifying voice, but also offering a platform for people who are often left out of decision-making processes. As an example, folks who may be a single parent working two jobs to support their family. Their priorities really aren't to carve out a platform to voice their opinions. They have other priorities, so therefore they're often left unheard. So how do we offer that platform? Obviously, easier said than done. But in parallel to that, we're calling out greenwashing where it exists, right? And what's happening with SMRs in New Brunswick and elsewhere in Canada is just absolutely ridiculous. The fact that they're calling it clean energy, it's complete BS. Let's call it what it is. So we're here to support the great folks that are on this call, and it's really nice to see people from diverse backgrounds, cultures, speaking different languages, all coming together to fight this common cause. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Greg. And now I'll call on Gail Wiley, who's with the Coalition for Renewable Responsible Energy Development in New Brunswick. Get my tongue around that, Gail. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Janice. I'm the Fredericton Council of Canadians rep on the coalition, CRED New Brunswick, which was formed in the spring of 2020. Environment and civil society groups here had been pressing the New Brunswick government to implement the 2016 all-party report on climate change by pursuing both clean renewable energy, wind, solar, and geothermal, and energy efficiency programs. But suddenly the provincial narrative became saving the climate through carbon-free small modular reactors. This was shocking to have a radioactive waste producing technology promoted as an environmental savior. It was also surprising given the high cost of nuclear power compared to the lower cost of wind and solar. And all this is happening while New Brunswick Power is carrying a very large debt from the refurbishment of La Pro in 2012. But the biggest shock was that it was being promoted by a federal government that had not even mentioned nuclear expansion as an election issue, let alone ever held public education or consultation on a new technology with cost, pollution, and security issues. So CRED New Brunswick was formed to promote clean renewable energy plus energy efficiency, and we began by countering what we understand to be a false narrative by providing public education and dialogue on SMRs in webinars with expert speakers and international partners on different aspects of SMR technology, beginning with Dr. Edwards in March 2020, a stream of articles and letters in local and national print media, drawing on widespread expertise, and radio and television interviews from New Brunswick to BC. My interest in nuclear technology began in the early 1970s by attending debates on the University of Toronto campus and also at my nearby church. These were all about implementing nuclear power in Ontario. I feel privileged to be learning so much more through these webinars and their recordings.
Thanks, Gail. And now I'll hand it over to Nancy Covington, who is with the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Nancy?
Thank you, Janice. And hello, everyone. I am a retired family physician, worked in Halifax, and I'm now in Mahone Bay. Our group International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War Canada is the Canadian affiliate of the international group with the same name, IPPNW. IPPNW's mission is to eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons and was formed in 1980. At that time, physicians from both sides of the Iron Curtain became aware that nuclear weapons had become the biggest threat to existence, and hence advised their political leaders of this. For their efforts in de-escalating the Cold War, they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. The Citizens Movement International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons grew out of IPPNW and created the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Although this treaty is now international law, making nuclear weapons illegal, Canada remains steadfast in its refusal to join. All energy has its polluting qualities, and we know much about the perils of burning fossil fuels. But in a hidden, sneaky way, indeed, all amount of radioactive material in our bodies from both nuclear power plants as well as from fallout from atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. The fact that plans are being made to extract plutonium at the Point Lepreau site is very worrying from a nuclear weapons proliferation viewpoint. After all, India made their nuclear weapons from a gift of nuclear power from Canada. This webinar may indeed help us understand the connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And I thank you all very much for organizing this.
Thank you, Nancy, for being a co-host. So one more thing before we turn it over to the panelists. You may ask questions of our panelists by typing them in the Q&A forum, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And our chat master in the chat is Brian Beaton, whose face you can't see, but I assure you he is there, and he is going to be directing you to the Q&A with your questions. Now, please keep your questions simple. If you have more than one question, enter them separately. And if someone has posted a question that you are interested in, please upvote it. So click on it to indicate that you like it. And when we go to select questions to pose to our panelists, the questions that have lots of upvotes are going to be asked first. So go ahead and do that. And some questions will be answered in writing during the webinar as well. So if your question hasn't been asked and answered live, check to see if it's already been answered in writing. Okay, let's move on to the main event here. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is MV Ramana. Ramana is the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security, and Director of the Liu Institute for Global Issues at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, and a scholar at the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. He is the author of The Power of Promise, Examining Nuclear Energy in India, and co-editor of Prisoners of the Nuclear Dream. Ramana is a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials, the Canadian Pugwash Group, the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group, and the team that produces the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Leo Szilard Award from the American Physical Society. So Ramana, I'll let you introduce your talk.
Thank you very much, Janice. And thanks to Susan and all the other co-sponsors. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. The Musqueam have called this area home for many thousands of years. And it's probably appropriate that we start by acknowledging them because some of the risks posed by what we are talking about will last for even longer than they have been living here. It's also important to recognize that Indigenous people have been often subject to some of the environmental and health impacts of nuclear power around the world, not just in Canada, but including the country that I come from, India, for example. The focus of my talk is going to be the two nuclear reactor designs that have been planned for the Bay of Fundy. And so these are what have been described as two fourth generation advanced small modular reactor designs, and include ARC 100 and Moltex. These two designs are very different from the traditional CANDU reactors that Canada has. In many places, there are 19 operating CANDU reactors right now in Canada, including one in New Brunswick and 18 in Ontario. But none of those operating reactors have incorporated the kinds of designs and the principles that underlie these two reactor designs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these designs and explain some of the concerns that we have about these choices. So let me start with ARC 100. So this is a scale up of a reactor, an experimental reactor that operated at the Argonne National Laboratory in the United States for nearly 3 decades. The reactor is what's called a fast neutron reactor. In other words, when the neutrons that are produced during the fission reactions, these neutrons, when they're produced, they are actually quite fast. They are highly energetic. And in many reactors, such as the CANDU reactors, these neutrons are slowed down using water, heavy water in the case of CANDUs, regular water in the case of so-called light water reactors, which are common in the United States. Unlike those designs, the ARC 100 design does not use a moderator. And what this means is that as a result, you have to have a very concentrated, in a physical sense, quantity of fissile materials. In the case of ARC 100, that is enriched uranium fuel, which means that the uranium which is found in nature has to be processed in order to concentrate the lighter of the two main isotopes, the two main kinds of uranium that you find in nature, uranium-235 and uranium-238. And uranium-235 is the particular component of uranium that undergoes fission in nuclear reactors easily. And for a reactor like ARC 100, you would, because it relies on very fast energetic neutrons, which have a relatively low probability of creating other fission reactions, what these reactor designers have to do is to pack the reactor core with a lot more of this material that can undergo fission reactions. So in this case, it is uranium-235. This reactor could also be operated using plutonium in principle. And the design, a reactor of the similar design that I'm most familiar with is being constructed in India. It's called the prototype fast breeder reactor. That one uses plutonium as fuel. The next result of not using a moderator is that the reactor core tends to be much smaller because there's nothing to slow down the neutrons. And as a result, the heat that is produced in the reactor is produced in a very small volume, right? And so the density of heat is so high that the only way that it can be effectively transported out of the reactor core is to use some kind of a molten metal. Water is just not efficient enough to do that job. And so the use of molten sodium, in this particular reactor design, they use molten sodium. There are other fast reactors that have used other metals, such as lead. The problem with molten sodium is that, I will explain, there are a number of problems that come as a result of using molten sodium. The last thing I want to say, which is unusual about ARC 100, is that the kind of uranium fuel that is used is what's called metallic. In other words, in reactors like in CANDUs, the uranium is used in the form of an oxide, uranium oxide. And in contrast, the ARC-100 design uses it in a pure metallic form, in purely uranium form. And the problem with that is it starts swelling upon irradiation. And this used to be a problem. There are ways of trying to get around it, but no such ways have been ever used in any commercial reactor so far. So that just sort of underlines the experimental nature of this reactor design. Before I go on to the problems of these particular choices, let me say a little bit about Moltex as well. So Moltex is a variant of something called the molten salt reactor design. In these designs, the fuel, uranium or plutonium, is not in a solid form, but actually dissolved in some kind of a salt. So the salt that most of us are familiar with, table salt that we use in our cooking, that is sodium chloride, but there could be other salts such as potassium chloride and other chlorides, or fluorides for that matter. So instead of having a solid fuel, these molten salt reactors use a molten salt in which the fissile material has been dissolved. Now, what Moltex is trying to do is to put this dissolved molten material into fuel tubes, which are what it calls vented. Ed, who's sort of talking after me, knows a lot more about what the complications of that venting are. And basically it has to do with the fact that in order to keep the reactor functioning, some of the fission products will have to be separated out and stored on the reactor. That is, again, a different kind of a hazard that might, under certain circumstances, be released. I won't talk much more about that because I would like to, because we don't really know a lot about this reactor design. So one of the reasons I've put the word reactor in quotes is that there is no clear design as such. As far as we can see, the design is very preliminary. If you look at different publications, they give different details about what kind of salt they're going to use, what kind of materials they're going to use. And so one has to sort of look at this as still a very early stage design at best. The other unique thing about Moltex, I should sort of go back to this picture that I showed here. So there are, as I said, there's very little published literature on Moltex. So this particular picture on the right side, which shows Moltex, is actually a screen capture from a little video that they have on their website. And the video basically has some kind of a computer animation or design of a imagined reactor. And you can see the bay in the background and these two kinds of buildings here. So the building SSRW is their reactor. And the other building on the background, the so-called WATS, is a facility that is supposed to use spent nuclear fuel from CANDU fuel and convert it into the fuel for this reactor through a kind of a reprocessing process, which again, Ed is going to talk about. All right. Both of these reactors are, as I said, still quite preliminary. They have, one of them has gone through a design review of sorts at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And the other one, Moltex, is still going through that. It's submitted something, and we don't have any reports as such from CNSC about how good the design is and what kinds of issues they are. I'll sort of add to that I don't expect to see a very critical or thorough review of this. The pre-licensing vendor design review seems to be a process by which essentially CNSC looks at the design and says, well, we don't see any particular problem with this design being licensed, rather than saying, we think this design is good enough to be licensed. And if I may sort of use a loose analogy, it is like if I were to take my teenage daughters to the local registry of motor vehicles, and then they say, okay, we have the service by which if you pay us $50, we can look at your children and say whether we think they can get a license or not. And so I pay them $50, they look at them and say, okay, can you guys see? Can you read? Can you sit properly? Can you hold the steering wheel, etc., etc.? Okay, looks good. They don't check whether you can actually drive the car. Okay, so it's a little bit like that. Anyway, as a result of this kind of a vendor design review, they have highlighted a number of problems with, not problems, but at least the novelty of the ARC 100 design. And this is important because CNSC does not have any experience with licensing these kinds of designs in the past. They have only dealt with heavy water reactors in the commercial area. So there's going to be a learning curve for CNSC members themselves to figure out what are the right questions to be asked, what are the kind of safety concerns that ought to be studied, and what are the other operational challenges that might be. So again, to sort of reinforce the point, these designs are quite early stage at this point. Now, let me talk a little bit about the problems with sodium-cooled reactor. The problems start with the fact that sodium is a very difficult material to deal with. It has great properties in terms of how it conducts heat, but as we might know from high school chemistry, it doesn't interact very well with either water or air. So if it ever comes in contact with water or air, you're going to have some trouble there. And this has led to a number of operational issues at many nuclear reactors. And for example, the Monju reactor in Japan was constructed after a lot of design process and so on. And in 1995, if I remember right, they had a fire as a result of, and this fire involved sodium. And as a result of the fire, the reactor was shut down and eventually just decommissioned without actually operating for more than a very short period of time. The other issue with sodium-cooled reactors, and I'll talk about that as well, is that they have some safety issues. And the picture on the right side is of a fast neutron reactor constructed in Germany in a place called Kalkar, which Germany actually decided not to ever commission, but it was eventually sold to a Dutch businessman who converted it into some kind of a theme park, an amusement park. And so what you're seeing on the right is a picture of that amusement park. So I often joke that this is the only fast reactor that's actually made any money on it. In terms of operational difficulties, I mean, here's the tables here show a couple of things. What you want to see is that in the first table on the top, the numbers on the bottom are measures of how well these reactors have operated in terms of efficiency. And you find that many of them, with the one exception of maybe the Russian BN600 and to some extent the Russian BN800, most of them have not very good numbers. In particular, the number on the extreme right, the Super Phoenix, is a sodium-cooled reactor that was constructed in France, which was after first a test pilot reactor called Rhapsody, and then a reactor called the Phoenix. And the Super Phoenix was supposed to be built on the learning of all of those. And it performed miserably. Less than 8% of the maximum amount of energy it could have produced was actually produced. And one of the reasons is that many of them, and now I come to the table on the right, on the bottom, which show the number of leaks of sodium in all of these things. And you see that this has been a sort of a repeated problem, and many of these reactors have had numerous sodium leaks, including the BN600, the Russian reactor. And one of my, somebody whom I know from the fast reactor program in India, who studied this issue for many years, has pointed out that the possible cause for this is a series of chemical interactions between the carbon that is included in all the steel. Any steel will have a certain amount of carbon, and which is used in all the metallic components. That interacts with the sodium in a complex series of ways, which causes the system's metal parts to corrode and eventually leading to leaks. So this may be a fundamental problem with all of these reactor designs, as opposed to saying, oh, there was something wrong with that particular design because of the way it was built or it was manufactured and so on and so forth. Okay. The other issue with these kind of reactors is that they are vulnerable to a special kind of a reactor, an accident that is not possible in CANDU reactors or in light water reactors, the so-called core disassembly accidents. And Ed has written a lot more about this in this report that recently he published. I don't think he's going to talk about it, but I encourage all of you to go and look at this report in more detail. But these accidents happen because the core is not in its most reactive configuration, as it were. So when the core starts melting, it actually drives the accident further. There's a kind of a positive feedback loop. And the kind of energies that can be released in these kind of accidents are so large that no structure is likely to hold the reactor together. The containment structure will give way in these kinds of accidents. So this is something, again, which is unique to the ARC-100 type reactor designs. Many of the problems that I've been talking about have been experienced around the world. Many countries have actually canceled their fast reactor programs. And this has been after spending something of the order of $100 billion around the world. Most of that expenditure was in a handful of countries. This is the plot of all the expenditures, annual expenditures in OECD countries. So that includes the United States, Canada, France, and so on. It does not include countries like China, India, Russia, and so on, right? And you can see there was this big burst sort of in the 1970s and 80s, and eventually they just gave up because all of these reactors were just performing quite badly. But of course, once you set up a group to design and research these kind of reactor designs, those groups never die away. So they keep getting these funding, and every now and then when they find a suitable opportunity, such as in New Brunswick, they sort of jump in for the kill and say, we have this great idea for you guys. Why don't you fund us to build one of these? But the lesson of this history is that it's unlikely to succeed. Okay, now I'll turn a little bit to the sort of molten salt reactors. The one molten salt reactor, really, I mean, there's one earlier one which was meant to make a nuclear-powered aircraft. I'm not going to include that as a power reactor basis, but there was one molten salt reactor design that operated between 1965 and 1969 at the Oak Ridge site in Tennessee in the United States. Even though the proponents of molten salt reactors and thorium reactors often point to it, if you look at the actual operational experience, it has not been particularly good. During just these 4 years, the reactor had to be interrupted or shut down about 225 times, including all kinds of problems with the way the reactor operated. And after it was shut down in 1969, in the 50 odd years, they have not successfully succeeded in trying to deal with all the kind of waste products that have been produced in the project. And till now, they've been spending of the order of $10 million a year for just this tiny 8 megawatt power thermal power reactor that operated for a few years. So any molten salt reactor, we have to be prepared for spending huge amounts of money after the reactor is shut down, after it stopped producing electricity, just to deal with the waste. And this is sort of and so to generalize that point, if you look at both of these fast reactor and these molten salt reactors, this is a picture that was produced by Lindsay Kroll, who was a postdoc with my colleague Alison McFarlane. They did some extensive work thinking about radioactive waste from different reactors. They didn't look at either ARC-100 or Moltex, but if you look at the pictures here, the graphs here, the 400 megawatt MSR and the 30 megawatt fast reactor are also similar to ARC-100, to Moltex and ARC-100 respectively. But the general principles, what they find is that one, they produce multiple types of waste. These have more volume than, not less, compared to regular light water reactors. They have high fissile content, which means the amount of uranium-235 or plutonium can be quite high, which means that when you try to dispose these off in a repository, should they decide to do that, there will be concerns about the system going critical again. and that these are in chemical forms that are very difficult to deal with. For example, the ARC 100 produces spent fuel which might be linked to sodium because the fuel form is in that particular form, and so that's actually not an easy material to deal with. This is the time it's going to take to get these reactors to the point where they can be constructed is going to be significant. This was a projection made way back in 2008 about sort of similar sorts of designs, and none of that has actually come true. The design that is sort of furthest along is in the United States. It's called NuScale, and it's not likely to be built before the end of this decade, even though the development of that design started in the early 2000s. Costs of these things are not going to be reliable. They're typically much more expensive than initially projected, and these costs are much higher compared to, projected costs are much lower compared to actual SMRs that are being built. The other points which I think are well known is that the other sources of electricity are cheaper and becoming cheaper because solar and wind are becoming much cheaper as we go on. One final point which I want to say is that typically in Canada, the SMR proponents have been talking about remote communities and mines that might require these. My colleagues and I did a calculation of how much it might cost to generate electricity from this, and we find that it could be up to 10 times as expensive to use a small modular reactor. And even with a high carbon tax, it's not going to really make sense. So I'll sort of end by saying, both of these designs are very preliminary, will require a lot of time and money for research and development before they can actually be constructed. All of them have various technological challenges having to do with the materials they use, the use of the coolant, namely sodium, and reprocessing, which Ed is going to talk about. And even under the best possible circumstances, if everything goes well, they will be producing expensive electricity, and there's no viable commercial market for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramana. We're going to move on now to our second speaker, who is Dr. Edwin Lyman. He's the Director of Nuclear Power Safety at the Union of Concerned Scientists in Washington, D.C. He has published articles in journals, including Science, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Science and Global Security, and Arms Control Today. Dr. Lyman has also co-authored the book, Fukushima, The Story of a Nuclear Disaster, and he currently serves on a U.S. National Academy of Sciences panel on the merits and viability of advanced reactors and fuel cycles. He earned a BA in physics from New York University in 1986 and a PhD in physics from Cornell in 1992. So, Dr. Lyman, the floor is yours.
Terrific, thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So in the US, we typically do not make a land acknowledgement, but given the context here, I am in Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostans and neighbors the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. Now I'm going to talk about the problems with pyroprocessing, which is the technology that Moltex is hyping in particular to produce its fuel. So Moltex has been championing this, this technology known as pyroprocessing, which it calls cheap, simple, efficient, clean, and proliferation resistant as a way to extract plutonium from or recycle CANDU spent fuel for use as fresh fuel in the Moltex reactor, as Ramana talked about just now. And if you listen to the company, you would think that they are, that this is a well-established, cheap and simple technology that will be able to reuse or recycle spent fuel and solve the Canadian spent fuel problem. But I've been monitoring the only industrial scale pyroprocessing system in the world, which is here in the United States in Idaho, and it's been operating for 25 years. And the experience with this system has not been a success, to put it mildly. In fact, for more than 2 decades, the US Department of Energy has operated a facility at a much lower throughput, that is, the rate of processing is much lower, and a much higher cost than it originally anticipated or promised Congress and the American people. And in addition, pyroprocessing as a form of spent fuel reprocessing extracts materials that are attractive for use in nuclear weapons and thus has high proliferation terrorism risks. Moltex contends that pyroprocessing somehow has properties, which means it doesn't actually increase the risk of proliferation. These are arguments that have been thoroughly debunked. The proponents of this technology for many decades have been making this argument, but US nuclear weapons laboratories have made clear that it simply is not true. And it's a little discouraging to have to keep highlighting and the facts that have come out a long time ago, but people continue to make the same misleading arguments over and over again. Just a word about CANDU spent fuel. It's mostly uranium, and only about 0.4% of the spent fuel is actually plutonium and other so-called transuranic elements, that is, elements that are heavier than plutonium and could potentially be used as fuel in the Moltex reactor. The remainder is uranium, and there are highly radioactive fission products. So Moltex proposes to pyroprocess CANDU spent fuel to extract that very tiny amount of plutonium and transuranic elements and some of the uranium for production of fuel for what it calls its stable salt reactor. But by my estimate, it would take around 750 tons of spent CANDU fuel to separate enough plutonium for a single 300 megawatt stable salt reactor. And again, only less than 0.5% of that material is plutonium. You would need about another 0.5% of the uranium from this CANDU spent fuel, leaving over 99%, or something like 740 tons of radioactive waste. So the notion that this process is going to effectively recycle nuclear waste is clearly absurd. Here is a graph of the proposed, or one of the proposed, fuel compositions for the Moltex reactor. And as Ramana pointed out, there are many different variants floating around in the small amount of public information about this plant. But you can see that it would have roughly the same weight of plutonium chloride and uranium chloride. The remainder would be potassium chloride, and there would be a small quantity of fission products, mainly from the lanthanide group of the periodic table. And this is significant because lanthanides are elements that have chemical properties similar to plutonium. And in this pyroprocessing process, some of them will get carried over with the product. Now, we heard about the EBR-2, which was the US experiment with a metal-fueled sodium-cooled fast reactor that shut down in 1994 by the Clinton administration, partly because it was inconsistent with that administration's non-proliferation policy. And shutting down the reactor left a substantial amount of irradiated fuel from the fast reactor. Some of it had rather highly concentrated or highly enriched uranium. This is the fuel that is actually used to drive the nuclear reaction. And there's a relatively small amount of driver fuel. Most of the fuel was what was called blanket fuel. And this was originally a depleted uranium metal that, as it was irradiated, a small amount of plutonium accumulated in it. And so it's really the blanket fuel that's most analogous to CANDU spent fuel because of the low burnup and the small amount of plutonium. So as EBR was operating, the Department of Energy was very anxious to develop what they closed fuel cycle and demonstrate reprocessing and recycling of the spent fuel. And they developed the so-called electro-refining process, which we call pyroprocessing. This is really a fancy term for electroplating. In other words, you have a molten salt bath where you stick a metal material on an anode. So it's sort of like a battery or an electrochemical cell. That metal will dissolve into the salt depending on its properties, the properties of the different constituents, and then it will plate out on a cathode. And so in this way, you can actually dissolve the metal and plate out elements that you want and extract it. And things that you don't want stay in the salt. And originally, the intention was to extract both uranium, relatively pure uranium on one cathode, and then extract plutonium and these other transuranics on another cathode. And here's an example or a diagram of that process. And the point here is just to show that it's really not so simple. And actually, this is a pretty oversimplified diagram of this very complex process. But what I want you to look at is all the different types of waste forms that are actually generated. And this is typical of reprocessing. So spent nuclear fuel is a bad thing. It's a dangerous substance. But when it comes out of a CANDU reactor, it's essentially in a solid form. And if it hasn't been damaged, it's a fairly robust material. But what reprocessing does is it dissolves that material and it separates it out into various constituents and generates all sorts of different waste forms. And pyroprocessing is no exception. You have the metal cladding from the CANDU fuel, which would go into, which is somewhat radioactive and become one waste form. You would have the contaminated salt where a lot of the fission products end up. That would be another waste form. And then you have other materials that don't play so well in this process that would have to be treated separately. And then you have all that uranium left over, which it turns out is not as clean as Moltex says it is. And in fact, that would be radioactive waste as well. And then you have the product that you want, plutonium, other transuranics, and it's only not waste if it's actually used somewhere. So the EBR-2 shutdown left about 26 tons of fuel, which the Department of Energy decided needed to be pyroprocessed because it claimed it could not be disposed of directly in the Yucca Mountain Repository, which was the U.S. Facility for disposal of spent fuel, which has never actually been built. But because they claimed the fuel was incompatible with that repository, they had to process it. And about 22.4 tons from the EBR-2 was this blanket fuel material and a small amount of driver. But because for proliferation reasons, DOE decided not to actually extract the plutonium from the spent fuel. It developed a modified flow sheet where it would just extract the uranium and leave the plutonium and everything else in the salt, and that would become a waste form. So DOE hasn't actually demonstrated a process where you would separate out the plutonium on an industrial scale. And here's this revised process. So the process that Moltex would use, where the plutonium would be extracted, hasn't even been demonstrated. Now, even though they simplified the process, it didn't work very well. And back in 2000, the Department of Energy promised that they could use this process and they would be able to get through the entire stockpile of that 26 tons of material in about 8 years. That corresponds to an average rate of about the average rate should be about 3 tons a year, right? So, but they ramped up So the maximum rate they promised to achieve would be about 5 metric tons a year in their facility. But by 2007, it turned out that they weren't having much success at actually getting through that stockpile, and they were only, and they changed their projection and said we're actually going to only be able to do about a little more than 1 ton a year, which would extend out the timeline for finishing the material by decades. But what actually happened today is that the rate was much smaller than even they projected in 2007, only a few hundred kilograms a year on average. So they're much smaller. They've been able to process the material at a much lower rate than they ever imagined at the beginning, and the process has not worked very well. And here's an example of the early years process. The best they could ever do was around less than 800 kilograms total in 1 year. And that never got back to that. So, so it was really 30 times slower than the initial projection. And the cost also ballooned. So the original cost they projected, and these are US dollars, was about less than $18,000 a kilogram for pyroprocessing the spent fuel from the EBR-2. But the actual cost on average to 2020 is worked out to around 50,000 US dollars per kilogram. And in the last few years, it's been a lot more than that, around $80,000 per kilogram. So if you think about that 750 tons of candid fuel that I think would be needed to produce that first core for a 300 megawatt reactor, and they can't do it better than what DOE has done historically, that would be around $40 billion. But even if they do a lot better, the bill for that fuel is still going to be enormous. I don't think there's any way around that. Now, I talked about the waste generation of this process. In fact, the different waste streams that have been generated in the US are by and large not being dealt with. So the salt, where a lot of the fission products and the plutonium have ended up, was supposed to be turned into a ceramic waste form that would be suitable for a geologic repository. That never happened. So they're stuck with that salt. It's still sitting in the facility. It's been there for 25 years, and they don't have a plan. They don't know what to do with it. It's a molten salt with a lot of plutonium fission products in it, chemically reactive, can't be disposed of directly, and they don't know what to do with it. And in addition, there's all the leftover uranium. And one of the features of pyroprocessing is that it doesn't separate anything very well. So that uranium actually is contaminated with enough plutonium and other fission products, so it's really not clean at all. And it would have been just a massive waste problem, except that one company had the bright idea of actually trying to use it in a fast reactor that they want to build at Idaho National Laboratory. That's a whole other story, but it will still have to be cleaned up in order to do that, and that'll cost a lot of money. So the pyroprocessing didn't work for a lot of reasons, but it's a very labor-intensive operation. It has to be done remotely. The manipulators you use to operate the process kept breaking down. It's very hard to do maintenance on this kind of facility. Now, to talk about the proliferation issues. So Moltex, again, has maintained that pyroprocessing doesn't increase the risk of nuclear proliferation because it doesn't produce separated plutonium. But again, this was something that US nuclear weapons labs addressed more than 10 years ago. And I would just direct you to this statement that advanced reprocessing approaches which produce group products in which plutonium is not separated from one or more minor actinides, that does not render the product unattractive for use in a nuclear weapon. And even if certain fission products are also carried over with that plutonium, as is the case for Moltex, that wouldn't change the conclusion, and pretty technical applied. This comes from the paper I just quoted. The important thing to notice here is anything in the pink area, any fuel composition in this pink area is attractive for weapons use. And so I plotted where I think the Moltex fuel would actually be, and it's clearly in this pink area because the burn up of the CANDU fuel is fairly low, and based on this composition, Moltex is in the pink area and it's weapons usable. IA safeguards are an important consideration, especially because there's going to be reprocessing and separation of plutonium. But there really is no technical approach right now for meeting the IAEA's verification goals, and that could be a problem for Canada if it wants to start up that facility without getting, without the IAEA having an accepted and effective safeguards approach in place. So in conclusion, the process has not been demonstrated to be reliable. Certainly at the scale that would be required, something like 1,000 times the maximum demonstrated rate in the United States just to produce that first core. There are other aspects of the process that haven't been demonstrated either. It generates multiple radioactive waste streams that don't have well-defined disposition paths. It increases nuclear proliferation terrorism, and there are still engineering challenges in every aspect of the process. So I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Lots of material to process there. Sorry. Let's move on to our final panelists, and then we will look to the Q&A to see what people want to ask more about. So our next panelist is Ron Tremblay. This is his birth name, although he goes primarily by his traditional name, Spazakzid Bazizim, meaning morning star burning. He is a citizen of Wolastoquk. The youngest of 10 children of the late Doris Sapir and Raymond Tremblay, Ron grew up with the Wolastoqey language, and he credits his mother Doris and grandparents Madeline Laporte and Louise Sapir for his genuine love of the language. He also acknowledges that they provided him with the wisdom to be true to himself and to always speak the truth. Ron has been guided by elders Harry Laporte, Alma Brooks, Gwen Bear, and Maggie Paul into a deeper understanding of their traditional and ceremonial ways. After years of involvement in various ceremonies, he gained wisdom and knowledge of the Wolastoqey way of life, and he practices the traditional ways of his ancestors. In November 2016, Ron was installed as a traditional Wolastoq Grand Chief and was mandated by the Wolastoqey grandmothers to always protect and preserve Wolastoquk, their traditional homeland and waterways. And Ron, the floor is yours.
Kshewaliwan Janice, Gudawidumkt Lazawaltamog, Kenzosuk is the Manuakated and Ledwa Baganan, the Oldake Waganan. Gaka Goswagodam Nil, Aga Malsamagodam, Aga Lewis no Spazagazit Pesazim. Kizigaki made it Nick Kijit Winog, Pside, the Mousewagan Kajitpid. Greetings. Thank you, Janice, for the introduction. And I want to acknowledge my clan systems. Through my mom's side, I represent the Crow clan, and through my father's side, I represent the Wolf clan. And through my name, Spazagazit Pisazim, which is that morning's, that first light that comes up in the east, it is my responsibility to carry those names and gain knowledge and wisdom from those, from my name and those two clan systems that I represent. And this is why that I must stand firmly, and as Janice read, that the clan mothers of the Grand Council has always told me that I need to stand and protect our homelands and our waterways and the air for our future generations. I am holding a sacred wampum belt. This was made from quahog shell. And this was given to me by one of my teachers. His name is Kisitanamug. He's from the Mashpee tribe in what the settlers call Massachusetts. Unfortunately, the quahog is slowly disappearing from our seacoast because of climate change. The waters are warming rapidly, and that the quahog is moving further north. And this is what we made our sacred wampum belts of from the sacred quahog shell. I'd like to thank the two academias who presented before me with their detailed and immense knowledge and their science background. And we have a little joke back in my community of Tobic. We called Nagutkug. Back in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, during the fall time, we always went to Maine to work in the potato fields. And many of us worked in the potato houses. So like after when we concluded the potato harvest, we all come back and say, well, we have a PhD. We have a potato house degree because we worked 3 weeks inside the potato house. So I want to invite you to sway away from the colonial mindset to enter what I call Skidinui Oldake Wagon. Is that it means the indigenous ceremonial way of life and the way of thinking. And what I said at the beginning of my talk is that I want to acknowledge the ancestors of my peoples who have sacrificed and preserved our beautiful and strong language and our ceremonies. And because through ceremony and through many ceremonies that I've been through in the last 30 plus years, is that through that, it gave me the wisdom and knowledge to understand my total connection to the land and to all of the flora and the fauna. And this gives me some background and commitment to protect our land and our waterways. And I like to take you away from the colonial mindset and put yourself into our moccasins and inside our canoes for a while. Prior to contact, our people lived here in our homeland, and we finally figured out how to live in balance and with all of creation. Through our powerful creation story, we understood our deep connection, to the trees, to the medicines, to the food, and all the animals that roamed around us. And we understood what our responsibilities were and are as human beings. And through our ceremonies, we understand that we are a mere thread in this huge web of life, that human beings only contribute to life in a very minimal sense. Is that, and I remember once during a powerful ceremony, one of the elders, as we sat inside the sweat lodge, and we were sitting there between the rounds, and he says, "Did you ever think what's below our feet?" He says, "Deep from the center of Mother Earth to her surface." He said, "There's more life that's below our feet that sustains us than there is above us." And why do we mess with that? Why do we mess with what we don't know below our feet? And he said, that's all sacred. He says, life is sacred. Recently, I was with one of the grandmothers from our nation, and she had the privilege of sitting with a group of the elders from our communities, and the word nuclear came up. So we asked the elders, can you please define the word nuclear in our language? Could you come up with a word? So they had to understand. So we tried our best to explain in detail exactly what nuclear was. So after a whole day of deliberation, they came up with this word. And the word is like Askamil Zanagwit, which translates to forever dangerous. Forever dangerous. So as we sat there, and the word, like Askamil means for eternity, and Zanagwit is it defines the danger. So this is how the elders within our communities defined what is called, what the present governments, the both federal and the provincial governments are called as green and safe forms of power. And I want to take you back into our original Longhouse Council fires and how our people used to meet. First and foremost, all the chiefs would go into their wigwam of silence for 4 days and 4 nights to meditate and to receive guidance and messages from the ancestors of our peoples. And then after the 4 days were complete, they sat with the clan mothers and they would share with the clan mothers the lessons that they had learned from the ancestors. Then after they would deliberate with the clan mothers would tell them how to present their speeches in the Longhouse. And this was true democracy. And once all the chiefs had presented, then they would discuss, and all the citizens from each nation would talk about solutions. And if no solution was finalized at the end of their sitting, they would table it till the next time. This is true consensus and true democracy. And let's picture that if we can put this type of governments, this type of governance in today's fraction, and putting this form of true democracy in North America or all over the world, things would slow down. Decisions would be made in a consensus basis based on what is good for all, not only for certain people or for corporations. But unfortunately, today we are faced with conflict within our own native nations. Many have adopted the colonial format of leadership, and many are Christians. So they have walked away from the original teachings and the original ways of life of peoples. As difficult as it is to say that a number of our people suffer from Stockholm syndrome, they have fallen in love with the oppressor. And this is where the conflict rests. And today in the Canadian Parliament, there's a bill that's being put forward, Bill C-15, which they are, I believe, in the third reading and to adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But there are problems with that document. in the UNDRIP, the Article 46 allows governments from all levels to veto past the free, prior, and informed consent of our people. So all the articles prior to 46 can be null and void from the colonial governments because they'd have a right to. So this is a huge concern for our people that this bill may be put through, and you know, all our citizens from the nations throughout Canada were not consulted. Only certain organizations were consulted through the Canadian government, and this is a deep concern from a lot of our citizens, from the traditional governments of British Columbia and here in the East Coast. Here in the East Coast, we have the strongest treaties. We have the 1725-26 Peace and Friendship Mascarene treaties, where it is clearly stated that no lands nor resources were ever surrendered. And this is where we lie. And the provincial and Canadian governments always telling us to take them to court, to challenge them. And we know that they have the resources to prolong the Supreme Court as long as they can, where we as Indigenous people have very limited resources. And to finalize, I just want to share a writing from a wonderful clan mother, the Charmaine Whiteface from the Zamola and Wabaga nations. I had the honor of meeting Charmaine at United Nations in Nordic City several times during a permanent forum, Indigenous permanent forum. And in fact, back in 1999, she was one of the first people to sit to sit at the table to discuss the development of the United Nations Declarations of Indigenous People, and the very final document that was eventually put forward was so watered down, according to Charmaine, that it was unrecognizable from the first draft. So what Charmaine says is, will the human rights of Indigenous people ever be upheld? Yes, but not by words or paper. When a system such as the one that dominates the globe today is all allowed to run rampant over human beings and natural resources and over virtually every piece of matter on the earth. And that system is destined to fail and eventually will fall. The time left for this current system, which includes North America, is very, very short. Cause and effort is the natural law that will prevail. So I want to thank you for listening to me, and hopefully I made a little bit of sense. Lehman.
I'm going to pick a few questions that are specific to our panelists and take advantage of them being here, and other questions hopefully Susan or Gail as CRED members could pick up. The first one is from Ole Hendrickson, who writes to, I suppose, either Ed or Ramana, are there well understood means to contain the gaseous fission products from these SMR designs, and he cites iodine, krypton, xenon, argon 40. How great is the risk that they would be released to the environment? So who wants to pick that one up?
Ed, I think you should go for this.
Ed?
Yes. So with regard to molten salt reactors, as Ramana mentioned, the Moltex design has salt that's contained in fuel tubes, but because as the fuel salt is irradiated, it does generate fission products. Some of them are gases, and they increase the pressure in that tube. So they have to be vented at the top to allow some of those gases to escape. So those gases will end up in the air, in the space above the core of the reactor. And so that has to be built to be very leak tight, because even small leaks could lead to a significant release of radiation from that reactor. So I think they have to be very leak tight. And one issue that should also concern Canadians is that the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, that's the international treaty on that prohibits nuclear weapon tests, which is not yet enforced, but there is an international monitoring system that's in place to verify the absence of nuclear tests. And that's because an underground nuclear explosion will release some short-lived fission products that can reactors also generate some of these same fission products. In fact, molten salt reactors are a particular problem because they don't contain these fission products the same way conventional reactors do. And so to prevent false alarms and effectively creating a background pollution that would make it very hard to implement the monitoring system for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, you really have to contain those fission products to a very, very high degree. And I'm not sure that the industry is actually able to do that. They need to have off-gas systems where conventionally, like the reactor Ramana talked about, the molten salt reactor experiment, there were these large beds of charcoal, very long, football field, US football field length structures where these gaseous fission products would be held up until they decayed. But that's a very cumbersome system, and there were problems with that as well. So it's not easy to contain some of these fission products, and that is one of the big concerns about molten salt reactors and even Moltex, because of the fact they vent some of the gases from their fuel.
Thank you, Ed. This one is to Ramana from Tom McLean. Your comment about solar and wind being less expensive power than SMRs per kilowatt hour for remote communities is what he's asking about. Did you assess that for remote northern communities in the NWT, Yukon, or Nunavut, which have extreme sunlight variation and a very cold climate?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of data about solar and wind in these remote communities. There are a few places, and especially in some of these mining sites, where they have tried to reduce diesel use through these. So the thing to remember is that the cost of generation itself is going to be roughly what we calculated. It can go up or down by a factor of 2 or something like that, depending on the actual remoteness of the site and the cost of setting up the solar plant. But that's not going to be the big difference. The main point about the variability of solar and so on means that at this point, the most likely outcome is that you will reduce diesel usage rather than eliminate it completely, right? So you'll have diesel, and on top, you'll try to reduce the amount of diesel you use by putting up wind turbines or solar panels. Now, in principle, as the cost of battery storage becomes lower, you could use more and more of those batteries to try and reduce even further the diesel usage. Now, the one thing which I want to point out is that even in the case of small modular reactors or any nuclear solution as such, you probably want to have a backup because at some point these reactors will have to be shut down, and you'll want to have some diesel backup there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Okay, thank you. And Ron, this is for you. And I'm glad to have a question for each of you. This is from Laura Myers, who is asking about the North Shore Mi'kmaq District Council. She says one of her environmental science students wrote a letter to the Premier expressing his support for the Woolastook Grand Council's resolution against the development of SMRs in New Brunswick, and Mr. Higgs replied to his letter and said that the two SMR vendors have met with the North Shore Mi'kmaq District Council. Her question is, does the North Shore Mi'kmaq District Council speak on behalf of the Woolastook Grand Council?
Thank you very much for the question. And the answer is no. And this is the problem when you get into discussion with either provincial or the federal governments, is that they use one paintbrush to paint all the nations, and saying that well we consulted with Indigenous people of either New Brunswick or Canada and so on. So no. And I wrote a letter to the North Shore Mi'kmaq District Council to let them know that, and I was as diplomatic as I could be, and I told them that they have no right when these reactors are being researched within our Woolastook homelands, is that they have no right to be part of that discussion. And if it was in Mi'kmaq territory, that I would not have a say what goes on in their homeland. So and I quickly responded to Premier Higgs and Minister Dunn, as well as the Energy Minister, to clarify that the Mi'kmaq district do not represent the Woolastook people. So,
okay, thanks for that clarification, Ron. This is a question from Andrea Loops, and she is asking, what is the time frame for this development? And in the context of how much time do we have to stop it? So I guess they're maybe on two different timelines. And is it Romana or Ed who wants to?
I can jump in first, yeah. Okay. So, I think the claim, and I think it's a reasonable one too, is that ARC 100 is further along and it could be the first one to be developed. This is official claim. So I think the official position is that it will be done by the end of the decade or very early in the next decade is when they expect to see it being operational. And Moltex is probably, 5 to 10 years after that. That's the official position. Now, in practice, if you think about it, I mean, many of these reactor designs have been under development a long time. So I can speak a little bit about the sodium cooled fast reactor being built in India. So that design has been in the works since the 1980s. Construction started in 2004. It was supposed to be finished by 2010. It's now 2021 and it's still not started operating, right? So these claims about, a decade from now, 5 years from now, are always going to be not true, right? So that's one aspect. The second thing is in terms of trying to organize and so on, I think the greater concern is that we are spending money on this right now. And this is a beast that is not going to go away. It's going to be absorbing more and more funding if they have to keep alive and continue with the research and development. And so they will be coming back for asking for more money from the governments. And once you've sort of invested a certain amount of money, you always have the temptation of saying, oh, we've already invested $20 million, $50 million, and putting in more into that. So in that sense, the time to organize is now before a lot more money goes down the stream.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at another sort of technical question here for our experts. How risky, this is from Sam Arnold, how risky was the decision by the Harper and Trudeau governments to waive the environmental impact assessment for SMRs at 300 megawatts and less? And how can this be permitted on the Bay of Fundy, especially when the two reactors combined will produce 400 megawatts of power on the same site? So,
Ed, you want to go for it? You can talk about the micro reactors that you've looked at and the Army study.
Yeah, I actually wasn't aware about the Canadian process, but it does remind me. So in the U.S., certainly the nuclear industry is making the argument that small reactors they have less radioactive material in them. They're easier to cool and shut down. They're just so safe that you don't need to have containment buildings. You don't need to have emergency planning. Some of them, they say you don't even need to have operators. You just turn them on and let them cook for 20 years. And they've argued, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US is actually embarking on a process for not eliminating the need for an environmental impact statement. That would be too far, but to have a sort of generic one that would be applicable to any reactor that could fit into this envelope of being small. And they haven't decided how small it is. But it's a myth to think that there is really any size that's small enough that you wouldn't need to evaluate thoroughly the environmental impacts. And I don't know the details of the Canadian law, but certainly the US, it's a pretty low bar before you could say you don't need to do an environmental impact statement for a new nuclear power plant. So it is shocking from an American perspective.
Thank you. We have run out of time, and this always happens when we have the complex topics and such informed speakers. And so I apologize to everyone who has questions in that were not able to be answered live. And hopefully we have a process for maybe keeping track of those and responding after the fact. What's being offered to us, of course, the public narrative is around these reactors is that they are clean energy sources and that they are the path towards decarbonization. But what's being offered to New Brunswickers and Canadians in other provinces is instead really a Faustian bargain. In order to cut our carbon footprint and avoid a climate catastrophe, we are told that we need nuclear power, which instead will extend and expand the toxic and radioactive burden that we have already burdened the future with, while simultaneously increasing the risk of nuclear proliferation. That's what our politicians are offering us. And I would say that that is not the best we can do. The education, the learning, the discussions are going to continue. We've really only scratched the surface. This has been enlightening on many fronts, and I want to thank the panelists very deeply who so freely share their expertise and wisdom to our collective decision-making about the future that we want for our province and for the world. Thanks again to the co-hosts who have organized this and providing the opportunity for all of us to learn more about these projects. And the link to this video will soon be on the MB Media Co-op website within a few days, and it possibly will be emailed out to participants. I don't know that for sure, but the website for sure. So I have to close it now and say good evening to everyone. Thank you again for coming. And I hope that it's moved us all along in our understanding of what's at stake. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. If anybody has any questions, you can easily find me through UBC, and I'm happy to answer it over email.
Thanks, Ramona.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks, Ed. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye, Ed.